The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Montana like a gray blanket, and Jake Morrison pulled his worn leather jacket tighter as he stepped out of his ranch house. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. At 43, Jake had been living alone on the Double M Ranch for the past 8 years, ever since his wife Sarah died in a riding accident. The silence of the early morning was something he'd grown used to, though it never stopped feeling heavy. Jake's boots crunched on the frost-covered ground as he made his way toward the barn. His daily routine was simple and predictable. Check the animals, repair whatever needed fixing, tend to the small vegetable garden Sarah had started, and try to keep busy enough that the loneliness didn't creep in too deep. The ranch covered nearly 3,000 acres, but most days it felt like the biggest, emptiest place on earth. The barn door creaked as he pulled it open, and that's when he heard it. A soft sound, like someone trying not to breathe too loudly. Jake stopped dead in his tracks, his hand still on the door handle. In 8 years of living alone, he'd never had an unexpected visitor. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the main road was even further. "Hello?" Jake called out softly, not wanting to startle whoever might be hiding in his barn. "Someone in there?" The sound stopped completely. Jake stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the gaps in the wooden walls. The smell of hay and old leather filled his nostrils, familiar and comforting. But something was different today. There was another scent, faint but distinct. Soap, maybe, or some kind of flower. Jake moved carefully between the horse stalls, his boots making soft sounds on the packed dirt floor. His old mare, Buttercup, nickered softly and nuzzled his shoulder as he passed. Everything seemed normal until he reached the back corner where he stored extra hay bales. That's where he saw her. A small figure was curled up behind a stack of hay, wrapped in a thin, dark shawl. At first, Jake thought it might be a child who'd gotten lost, but as he got closer, he could see it was a woman. She was Asian, Chinese, he thought, with long black hair that had partially escaped from a simple bun at the back of her neck. Her clothes were dusty and worn, like she'd been traveling for a long time. She was awake, her dark eyes watching him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She couldn't have been more than 30, but there was something in her expression that spoke of experiences far beyond her years. When she saw Jake looking at her, she pressed herself further back against the hay bales, as if trying to disappear. "Ma'am," Jake said gently, crouching down to make himself less intimidating. "You all right? You hurt?" The woman stared at him without speaking. Jake noticed she was shivering despite the relatively mild morning. Her shawl was thin, and her dress looked like it hadn't been washed in days. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her lips looked dry and cracked. Jake tried to think of what to say. He'd never been particularly good with words, especially with strangers. Sarah had always been the one who could talk to anyone, make them feel comfortable and welcome. But Sarah wasn't here, and this woman clearly needed help. "Do you speak English?" Jake asked, speaking slowly and clearly. The woman nodded once, barely perceptibly. "You running from something?" Jake asked. "Someone hurt you?" This time, the woman's eyes filled with tears, though she didn't make a sound. She nodded again, and Jake felt something twist in his chest. He'd always had a protective instinct, especially when it came to anyone who seemed vulnerable or afraid. Jake sat down cross-legged on the ground, putting himself at the woman's eye level. "My name's Jake Morrison," he said. "This is my ranch. You're safe here, okay? Nobody's gonna hurt you." The woman studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. After a long moment, she spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "My name is Li Wei," she said. Her English was accented but clear. "I am sorry for hiding in your barn. I had nowhere else to go." Jake felt a wave of sympathy wash over him. "How long you been out here, Li Wei?" 3 days, she replied, her voice still very soft. maybe 4. Time is difficult to know. Jake looked more closely at her condition. She was clearly exhausted and probably hungry. Her lips were chapped, and there were smudges of dirt on her face and hands. The dress she wore had once been nice, but was now wrinkled and stained with travel. "When's the last time you ate something?" Jake asked. Li Wei looked down at her hands. "Yesterday morning. I found some berries by a creek." Jake stood up slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Well, that won't do at all. How about you come up to the house with me? I'll fix you some breakfast and you can tell me what's got you running scared." Li Wei shook her head quickly. "I cannot. I do not wish to bring trouble to you." "What kind of trouble?" Jake asked, but Li Wei just shook her head again and looked away. Jake thought for a moment. He could see that she was afraid, but he couldn't just leave her in his barn to starve. "Tell you what," he said finally, "I'll bring some food out here to you, but you're gonna have to trust me enough to let me help. Deal?" Li Wei looked up at him again, searching his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her, because she nodded slightly. Jake walked back to the house, his mind racing. He had no idea what Li Wei was running from, but it was clear that she was in some kind of serious trouble. The decent thing to do was help her, but he also knew he needed to be careful. He lived alone, miles from anyone who could help if things went bad. In his kitchen, Jake put together a simple meal: eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. He added some of Sarah's homemade jam that he'd been saving, figuring Li Wei could use something sweet. He filled a large thermos with coffee and put everything on a wooden tray that Sarah had used for breakfast in bed on special occasions. When Jake returned to the barn, Li Wei was still in the same spot, but she'd adjusted her position so she could watch the door. She looked ready to run at any moment. "Here we go," Jake said, setting the tray down within her reach but not too close. "Nothing fancy, but it's hot and filling." Li Wei stared at the food like she couldn't believe it was real. "You are very kind," she said softly, "but I have no money to pay you." "Did I ask for money?" Jake replied with a slight smile. "Go on, eat up before it gets cold." Li Wei reached for a piece of toast with shaking hands. She took a small, careful bite, and then another. Soon she was eating steadily, though she kept glancing up at Jake as if to make sure he was still there. Jake sat down on a bale of hay a comfortable distance away and waited. He could see that Li Wei was struggling between hunger and caution. Every few bites, she would pause and listen, as if expecting to hear someone coming. "Li Wei," Jake said after she'd eaten most of the eggs and bacon, "I want you to know that whatever you're running from, you're safe here. This ranch is isolated and I don't get many visitors. If you need a place to rest and figure out your next step, you're welcome to stay." Li Wei set down her coffee cup and looked at him with surprise. "You do not know me. You do not know what I have done." "I know you're scared and alone," Jake replied. "I know you're hungry and tired. That's enough for me." Tears started to flow down Li Wei's cheeks, though she tried to wipe them away quickly. "In my country, I was married to a man named Chen. He was not a good man, but my family arranged the marriage when I was very young. We came to America 5 years ago to California." Jake nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Chen worked for other Chinese men who brought workers from China, but they were not treated well. Chen became involved in bad things, gambling, fighting, taking money from workers who could not pay their debts." Li Wei's voice grew even quieter. "I tried to leave him many times, but he always found me. He said he would kill me if I tried to leave again." Jake felt a surge of anger at this Chen character, but he kept his expression neutral. "What happened 3 days ago?" "There was a fight. Chen and some other men were gambling, and someone accused him of cheating. There was shooting." Li Wei's hands were trembling as she spoke. "Chen was killed. But before he died, he told the other men that I knew where he kept his money. They came looking for me. Did you know where the money was? Jake asked. Li Wei nodded reluctantly. Chen had a bag hidden in our room. I took it when I ran, but I threw it in a river when I realized they were following me. I did not want his stolen money. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing what she'd told him. So these men, they think you still have their money? Yes, and they will not stop looking for me. Li Wei looked directly at Jake. This is why I cannot stay. I will bring danger to you. Jake leaned forward. Li Wei, look at me. I've been alone on this ranch for 8 years. I know how to handle trouble, and I know right from wrong. Those men have no right to hurt you because of what your husband did. But I am Chinese, Li Wei said, as if that explained everything. In California, people do not help Chinese women. They think we are all the same, all involved in bad things. Jake felt another surge of anger, this time at the ignorance and prejudice Li Wei had clearly faced. Well, you're not in California anymore. This is Montana, and this is my land. Here, people are judged by their actions, not by where they came from. Li Wei stared at him for a long moment. You are very different from other Americans I have met. Maybe, Jake said. Or maybe you just haven't met the right Americans yet. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, with Li Wei finishing her breakfast and Jake thinking about the situation. He knew he was taking a risk by offering to help her, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Something about Li Wei reminded him of Sarah, not in looks, but in the quiet strength he could see beneath her fear. Li Wei, Jake said finally, I want you to consider something. You said you threw away that money because you didn't want any part of what your husband was involved in. That tells me a lot about who you are. You could have kept it and run far away, but you chose to do what was right, even though it made your situation harder. Li Wei looked surprised. I did not think of it that way. Well, I did, Jake said, and it makes me even more certain that I want to help you. But I need you to be honest with me about everything. If these men are dangerous, I need to know what we're dealing with. Li Wei nodded slowly. They are very dangerous. Chen told me stories about what they do to people who cross them. They have killed before. Jake absorbed this information without changing his expression. He'd dealt with dangerous men before, during his younger days when he'd worked as a ranch hand in some rougher parts of the territory. He wasn't easily intimidated. How many of them? Jake asked. I think 3, maybe 4. They dress like businessmen, but they carry guns. They speak Chinese and English both, Jake nodded. And they followed you this far from California? I think so. I have been careful to stay off main roads, but I saw riders behind me yesterday. I hid until dark, then came here. Jake stood up and walked to the barn door, looking out at his land. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the fields. Everything looked peaceful and normal, but he knew that could change quickly if Li Wei's pursuers had really followed her this far. Li Wei, Jake said, turning back to her, I'm going to ask you to do something that might be hard. I want you to trust me completely. That means doing what I tell you without question, at least until we know you're safe. Li Wei looked uncertain. What do you want me to do? First, I want you to come up to the house. You can't stay in the barn. It's the first place anyone would look. Jake saw her start to protest and held up his hand. I'm not trying to take advantage of you. I'm trying to keep you alive. The house is more secure, and I have weapons there if we need them. Li Wei thought about this for a moment. What if someone sees me? Nobody comes out here without me knowing about it long before they arrive, Jake said. And if those men do show up, I'd rather face them with you somewhere I can protect you properly. Li Wei stood up slowly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. She was shorter than Jake had expected, probably no more than 5 feet tall, but there was a dignity in the way she carried herself that spoke of inner strength. I will trust you, she said simply, but I want you to know that if danger comes because of me, I will not hide behind you. I am not helpless. Jake smiled for the first time since finding her. I didn't think you were, ma'am. I surely didn't think you were. Together they walked from the barn to the house, with Jake keeping an eye on the horizon and Li Wei staying close to his side. Neither of them spoke, but Jake could feel the weight of the decision they'd both made. He was committed now to helping this woman, and she was committed to trusting him with her life. As they reached the porch of the ranch house, Jake turned to Li Wei one more time. Once you step through that door, there's no going back. You'll be under my protection, and I take that seriously. Are you sure this is what you want? Li Wei looked at the house, then back at Jake's face. She seemed to see something there that gave her confidence, because she straightened her shoulders and nodded firmly. Yes, she said, I am sure. Jake opened the door and stepped aside to let her enter first. As Li Wei crossed the threshold into his home, Jake felt something shift inside him. For the first time in 8 years, his house wouldn't be empty. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he had someone to protect besides himself. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily over the Montana plains. Jake Morrison had woken up that morning expecting just another ordinary day. Instead, he'd found himself at the beginning of something that would change his life forever. Li Wei stood in the doorway of Jake's house, taking in her surroundings with careful eyes. The main room was larger than she'd expected, with rough-hewn wooden beams across the ceiling and a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Everything was clean but simple, with the kind of furniture that was built to last rather than to impress. Photographs in simple frames sat on a mantelpiece, and Li Wei could see images of Jake with a blonde woman who smiled brightly in every picture. That was Sarah, Jake said softly, noticing where Li Wei was looking. My wife. She passed on 8 years ago. Li Wei nodded respectfully. She was very beautiful. I can see happiness in her face. Jake felt a familiar tightness in his chest when he looked at Sarah's pictures, but today it was mixed with something else. Having Li Wei in the house made the space feel different, more alive somehow. She would have liked you, he said, surprising himself with the words. Li Wei walked further into the room, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors. She paused at a bookshelf that took up most of one wall, running her finger along the spines of the volumes. You read many books, she observed. Sarah was the real reader, Jake admitted, but I've been working my way through them since she's been gone. Helps pass the evenings. Li Wei pulled out a volume of poetry and opened it carefully. I learned English from books like this, she said. In China, my father was a teacher. He believed education was important for everyone, even daughters. Jake watched as Li Wei handled the book with obvious reverence. You miss him? Very much. He died before Chen brought me to America. I think if he had lived, he would not have allowed the marriage. Li Wei closed the book gently and returned it to the shelf. He taught me that knowledge makes us free, even when our circumstances do not. Jake was struck by the quiet intelligence in Li Wei's words. In the few conversations he'd had with women since Sarah died, mostly brief exchanges in town, no one had talked about books or ideas. Most people saw him as just a simple rancher, which was fine by him, but it was refreshing to talk with someone who seemed to understand that there might be more beneath the surface. Are you tired? Jake asked. You can rest in the spare room if you need to. Li Wei shook her head. I have rested enough. If I am to stay here, even for a short time, I should help. I do not like to be useless. Jake was about to protest that she was his guest, but something in Li Wei's expression stopped him. She had pride, he realized, and taking charity without giving something in return was probably difficult for her. Well, Jake said, I was planning to work in the garden today. Sarah planted vegetables behind the house, and I've been trying to keep it going. I'm not much of a gardener, though. Li Wei's face brightened for the first time since he'd found her. I know gardens. In China, I helped my mother grow vegetables and herbs. May I see? Jake led her through the kitchen and out the back door to where Sarah's garden struggled against the Montana soil. It had been a good garden once, but Jake's attempts at maintenance had been hit or miss. Some plants were overgrown, others had died from neglect, and weeds had taken over large sections. Li Wei walked slowly through the garden, examining the plants with an expert eye. She knelt down next to a patch of struggling tomato plants and gently lifted their leaves. "These need more water," she said, "and the soil is too hard. They cannot breathe properly." She moved to another section where herbs grew wild and untended. "But this is good. Sage, thyme, rosemary. Your wife knew herbs well." Jake felt a surge of pride and sadness. She did. She used to say the garden was her sanctuary. Li Wei stood up and brushed dirt from her hands. "It can be again, but it will need work." They spent the rest of the morning in the garden, with Li Wei showing Jake how to properly tend the plants his wife had loved. She worked with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years of experience, and Jake found himself learning more about gardening in a few hours than he had in the previous 8 years. As they worked, they talked. Li Wei told Jake about her childhood in China, about her father's school and her mother's herb garden. She spoke of the journey to America, the crowded ship, and the fear of the unknown. Jake found himself sharing stories about Sarah, about their life together on the ranch, about the loneliness that had settled over him after her death. "You loved her very much," Li Wei observed as they worked side by side planting new seeds in a cleared patch of earth. "More than I thought was possible," Jake admitted. "When she died, I felt like part of me had been cut away. I couldn't imagine ever caring about anyone that much again." Li Wei was quiet for a moment, her hands working steadily in the soil. "In China, we say that love does not die when a person dies. It remains in the world, waiting for the right place to grow again." Jake looked at her with surprise. "That's a beautiful way to think about it." "My father told me this when my mother died. I was very young, and I could not understand how the world could continue without her. He said that her love for me would always be part of who I was, and that someday I would have love to give to others because of what she had given me." Jake felt something loosen in his chest. A knot of grief that had been there so long he'd almost forgotten it was there. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was. I think he would have liked you also." They worked in comfortable silence after that, and Jake found himself watching Li Wei's graceful movements as she tended the plants. There was something peaceful about working alongside her. Something that felt natural and right in a way he hadn't experienced since Sarah died. Around midday, Jake went inside to prepare lunch while Li Wei continued working in the garden. Through the kitchen window, he could see her moving between the rows of plants, her dark hair catching the sunlight. She had found an old hat of Sarah's and put it on to protect herself from the sun, and she looked like she belonged there. Jake was cutting bread for sandwiches when he heard the sound of horses approaching from the east. He immediately set down the knife and went to the front window, his body tensing with alertness. Li Wei had heard it too and was standing motionless in the garden, her face turned toward the sound. 3 riders were coming up the main trail to the ranch, moving at a steady pace. Even at a distance, Jake could see they were well-dressed and riding expensive horses. They didn't look like local ranchers or traveling cowboys. They looked exactly like the men Li Wei had described. Jake quickly went to the back door and called to Li Wei in a low voice. "Li Wei, get inside, now." She ran to the house without question, her face pale with fear. "Is it them?" Jake nodded grimly. 3 men just like you said. Go to the spare bedroom and stay there. Don't come out no matter what you hear." Li Wei grabbed Jake's arm. "What will you tell them?" "I'll figure something out. Just stay hidden and keep quiet." Li Wei hesitated for a moment, then stood on her toes and kissed Jake's cheek quickly. "Be careful," she whispered, then disappeared into the back of the house. Jake took a deep breath and checked his rifle, which hung over the fireplace. He made sure it was loaded, then set it back in its place where it would be within easy reach but not obviously threatening. He had dealt with dangerous men before, and he knew the key was to appear calm and unremarkable while staying ready for anything. The riders approached the house at a deliberate pace, and Jake could see them looking around carefully, taking note of the barn, the garden, and the general layout of the property. When they stopped in front of the house, Jake stepped out onto the porch with his hands visible and a neutral expression on his face. The leader of the group was a thin man with a carefully groomed mustache and expensive clothes that looked out of place on the Montana frontier. His two companions were larger and rougher-looking, with the hard eyes of men who were comfortable with violence. "Good afternoon," the leader said in accented English. "I am looking for someone who may have passed through this area. A Chinese woman traveling alone." Jake kept his expression blank. "Can't say I've seen any Chinese folks around here. This is pretty isolated country." The man studied Jake's face carefully. "She is my wife," he said. "She became confused after a tragedy in our family and ran away. We are very worried about her safety." Jake almost smiled at the obvious lie, but he kept his face neutral. "That's terrible. When did you last see her?" "Several days ago in California. We have been following her trail and it leads this direction." The man gestured to his companions. "We have been asking at every ranch and settlement. Well, like I said, I haven't seen anyone." Jake crossed his arms and leaned against the porch railing, trying to appear relaxed. "You might try the Johnson place, about 15 miles north. They get more travelers than I do." The leader exchanged a glance with his companions, and Jake could see they weren't entirely convinced. One of the larger men spoke up in Chinese, and the leader responded in the same language. Jake didn't understand the words, but the tone was clearly argumentative. "My friend suggests we should search your property," the leader said finally, "to make sure she is not hiding somewhere, perhaps injured and unable to call for help." Jake straightened up, his hand moving casually closer to the rifle. "I'm afraid I can't allow that. This is private property, and I don't take kindly to strangers poking around my land." The tension in the air thickened immediately. Jake could see the two larger men shift in their saddles, their hands moving toward concealed weapons, but the leader held up a hand to stop them. "Of course, we understand property rights," the leader said smoothly. "Perhaps you would not mind if we just looked in your barn, in case she sought shelter there without your knowledge?" Jake pretended to consider this. "I suppose that would be all right, but I'll come with you." The three men dismounted and followed Jake to the barn. Jake made sure to walk slowly, giving Li Wei time to stay hidden and keeping himself between the men and the house. In the barn, the men looked around carefully, checking behind hay bales and in the horse stalls. Jake watched them closely, noting how thoroughly they searched and how familiar they seemed with this kind of investigation. "She is not here," one of the men said in English after they had examined every possible hiding spot. The leader nodded, but Jake could see he was still suspicious. "You live here alone?" he asked Jake. "That's right. My wife died some years back." "It must be lonely," the leader observed, his eyes scanning Jake's face for any reaction. "I keep busy," Jake replied evenly. The men searched for a few more minutes, then regrouped outside the barn. They spoke in Chinese again, their voices low and urgent. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could tell they were debating what to do next. Finally, the leader approached Jake again. "We are prepared to offer a reward for information about my wife," he said. $100 for anyone who has seen her." Jake whistled low. "That's a lot of money for someone who's just confused and lost." The leader's eyes hardened slightly. "She is very precious to us, and she may have taken something that belongs to our family when she left." "What kind of something?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about how the man would explain the stolen money. "Family heirlooms, things that have been in our family for generations. She may not have understood their value." Jake nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Well, if I see any Chinese woman with valuable family heirlooms, I'll be sure to let you know. Where can I reach you?" The leader hesitated. "We will be staying in the area for several days. We will check back with you." Jake felt a chill at these words. These men weren't going to give up easily, and having them in the area meant Li Wei would be in constant danger. "Suit yourselves," Jake said. "But like I told you, I haven't seen anyone." The men mounted their horses and rode away, but Jake noticed they didn't head toward the main road. Instead, they went north, in the direction of a rocky outcropping that would give them a good view of his ranch. Jake had a sinking feeling they intended to watch his property and see if Li Wei revealed herself. Jake waited until the men were completely out of sight, then went back into the house. He found Li Wei in the spare bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "They're gone," Jake said gently, "but they're not giving up. I think they're going to watch the ranch." Li Wei nodded, her face pale but determined. "I heard some of what they said." "The leader told his men they would wait and watch. He said I would have to come out eventually." Jake sat down in a chair across from Li Wei. "Did you understand everything they said?" "Most of it. They are not my husband's men exactly. They work for someone else, someone who wants the money Chen stole very badly." Li Wei looked at Jake with worried eyes. "They will kill you if they think you are helping me?" Jake leaned forward. "Li Wei, I want you to listen to me. I've made my choice. I'm not going to abandon you to those men, no matter what they threaten. But we need to be smart about this." "What do you mean?" "I mean we need to make them think you moved on, that you were never here." Jake stood up and began pacing. "Tonight, after dark, I'm going to create some tracks leading away from the ranch. Make it look like someone left on foot, heading toward the main road." Li Wei shook her head. "That will not work. They will follow the tracks and realize they are false." "Maybe, but it might buy us some time, and time is what we need right now." Jake stopped pacing and looked at Li Wei. "There's a place about 10 miles from here, up in the mountains. An old mine shaft that's been abandoned for years. If things get bad, we can go there and wait them out." Li Wei stood up and walked to the window, careful to stay out of sight. "You would do this for me? Leave your ranch, your home?" Jake joined her at the window, also staying back from view. "Li Wei, this ranch has been my whole world for 8 years. But having you here these past few days, it's reminded me that there are things more important than land and cattle." Li Wei turned to look at him, and Jake was surprised by the intensity in her dark eyes. "You are a good man, Jake Morrison, better than I deserve." "That's not true," Jake said firmly. "You deserve kindness. You deserve safety. You deserve a chance to build a life without fear." They stood there for a moment, looking at each other, and Jake felt something pass between them that he hadn't expected. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something deeper than protection or gratitude. "What happens now?" Li Wei asked quietly. Jake looked out at his land, at the mountains in the distance, at the life he had built and might have to leave behind. "Now we wait for dark, and then we make our move." As if in response to his words, storm clouds began to gather on the horizon. Jake watched them build and darken, thinking that maybe the weather would work in their favor. Rain would wash away tracks and provide cover for movement. Li Wei went back to work in the garden that afternoon, staying close to the house and keeping an eye on the surrounding hills. Jake busied himself with preparations, checking his weapons, packing supplies, and making plans for different scenarios. Every few minutes, he would scan the horizon for signs of the watchers he knew were out there. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Jake and Li Wei shared a quiet dinner. Neither of them spoke much, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that their lives were about to change dramatically. "Li Wei," Jake said as they finished eating, "I want you to know something. Whatever happens tonight, whatever we have to do to keep you safe, I'm glad you came here. These past few days have been the first time in years that I felt like I had a real purpose." Li Wei reached across the table and placed her small hand over his larger one. "You have given me something I thought I had lost forever," she said softly. "Hope." Outside, the storm clouds continued to build, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Jake squeezed Li Wei's hand gently, then stood up to prepare for the long night ahead. In a few hours, they would find out just how far the men hunting Li Wei were willing to go, and whether the bond that had formed between a lonely rancher and a frightened widow would be strong enough to survive what was coming. The rain started falling harder as darkness settled over the Montana landscape. Jake had spent the afternoon preparing for what he knew would be a dangerous night, while Li Wei had helped by gathering supplies and making sure everything they might need was ready to grab quickly. The storm worked in their favor, providing cover and washing away any tracks they might make. Jake waited until well past midnight before putting his plan into action. The rain was steady now, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, making the night as dark as he could hope for. He left the house quietly through the back door, carrying an old pair of Li Wei's shoes and a long stick. Moving carefully in the darkness, he made his way to the eastern edge of his property, where the ground was soft enough to take clear footprints. Working methodically, Jake used the stick and shoes to create a trail of footprints leading away from the ranch toward the main road. He made sure the prints looked like those of a small person walking quickly, but trying to stay hidden. Every few yards, he created signs that someone had paused to rest or look back, as if checking for pursuit. The rain would make the tracks harder to follow, but not impossible, which was exactly what he wanted. When Jake returned to the house an hour later, he found Li Wei waiting for him with a worried expression. She had changed into some of Sarah's old clothes, practical pants, and a shirt that would be better for traveling than her worn dress. "Did anyone see you?" she whispered as Jake dried off by the fire. "I don't think so, but those men are out there somewhere." "I could feel them watching." Jake hung his wet coat by the fireplace and checked his rifle again. "How are you holding up?" Li Wei managed a small smile. "I am scared, but not as much as I was before. Having you with me makes me feel stronger." Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. Over the past few days, his feelings for Li Wei had grown from simple protectiveness to something much deeper. She was intelligent, brave, and kind, and her presence had awakened parts of him that had been sleeping since Sarah died. "Li Wei," Jake said, moving closer to her, "I need to tell you something before things get more dangerous." She looked up at him with those dark eyes that had become so familiar to him. "What is it?" Jake struggled to find the right words. "These past few days with you have been the happiest I've been since Sarah passed. I know we haven't known each other long, and I know you're still running from danger, but I need you to know that my feelings for you are real." Li Wei's breath caught, and for a moment Jake worried he had said too much too soon. But then she stepped closer to him and placed her hand on his chest. "Jake, I feel the same way. When I was hiding in your barn, I thought my life was over. I thought I would never feel safe or happy again. But you showed me kindness when you had no reason to help me, and you made me remember what it feels like to be treated with respect and care." Jake cupped her face gently in his hands. "Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that you've brought light back into my life." Li Wei stood on her toes and kissed him softly. And Jake felt something inside him heal that had been broken for 8 years. When they broke apart, both of them had tears in their eyes. Their tender moment was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching through the rain. Jake immediately moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the curtains. 3 riders were coming up the path to his house, moving slowly and carefully in the darkness. "They're coming," Jake whispered urgently. "Get to the back bedroom and stay hidden. No matter what happens, don't come out unless I tell you to." Li Wei nodded and started toward the back of the house, but she paused at the doorway. "Jake, be careful. These men will not hesitate to kill you." "I know. I love you, Li Wei. I love you too." Jake watched her disappear into the back room, then positioned himself near the fireplace where his rifle was within easy reach. He had blown out most of the lamps, leaving just enough light to see by. The sound of hoofbeats stopped outside, and Jake could hear the men dismounting and talking quietly in Chinese. A hard knock came at the door. Jake waited a moment, then called out, "Who's there?" "Mr. Morrison, we met earlier today. We need to talk to you." Jake opened the door slowly, keeping his body positioned so he could reach his rifle quickly. The 3 men stood on his porch, water dripping from their hats and coats. The leader's friendly demeanor from earlier was completely gone, replaced by a cold, dangerous expression. "Gentlemen, it's awfully late for a social call," Jake said calmly. The leader pushed past Jake into the house without invitation, his 2 companions following. Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his temper in check. These men were dangerous, and he needed to be smart about how he handled them. "We found something interesting while we were waiting and watching your ranch," the leader said, walking around Jake's living room like he owned it. "Tracks leading away from your property, heading toward the main road." Jake forced himself to look surprised. "Tracks? What kind of tracks?" One of the larger men spoke up in heavily accented English. "Small footprints, like woman make." The leader studied Jake's face carefully. "Very fresh tracks, made after we spoke with you earlier. Now, how do you suppose a Chinese woman's footprints ended up on your land if you've never seen her?" Jake shrugged. "Could be anyone's tracks. Maybe she passed through without me knowing." "This is a big ranch." The leader smiled coldly. "Perhaps. But I think you are lying to me, Mr. Morrison. I think you have been helping my wife, and I think you know exactly where she is." Jake kept his expression neutral. "I told you before, I haven't seen any Chinese woman. If someone passed through my land, they did it without my knowledge." The second large man said something in Chinese, and the leader nodded. Then he turned back to Jake with a dangerous glint in his eyes. "My associates think we should search your house more thoroughly. They think you might be hiding something from us." Jake stepped closer to the fireplace, putting his hand casually on the mantelpiece near his rifle. "And I told you before, this is private property. You have no right to search my house." "Rights?" The leader laughed harshly. "Mr. Morrison, you are interfering with very dangerous people. Rights are something you worry about when you are dealing with civilized men." The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Jake could see that the other 2 men were positioning themselves to block his escape routes, and their hands were moving toward concealed weapons. "Let me tell you what I think happened," the leader continued, beginning to pace around the room. "I think my wife came here seeking shelter, and I think you, being a lonely man who hasn't seen a woman in years, decided to help her. Perhaps you even convinced yourself you were being noble." Jake said nothing, but his muscles tensed as he prepared for what he knew was coming. "The problem is," the leader went on, "my wife has something that belongs to my employer, something very valuable. And my employer is not the kind of man who forgives theft." "What makes you so sure she's here?" Jake asked, buying time while he calculated his chances against 3 armed men. The leader stopped pacing and looked directly at Jake. Because we followed her tracks to your barn. Because we can smell her perfume in this room. And because you are acting like a man who has something to hide." Jake realized his deception wasn't going to work. These men were too experienced, too thorough. It was time to try a different approach. "All right," Jake said, appearing to give up. "You're right. She was here, but she left this afternoon right after you visited. Your coming here spooked her and she ran." The leader's eyes lit up with satisfaction. "Now we are getting somewhere. Which direction did she go?" Jake gestured toward the east. "Toward the main road. She said she was going to try to get to the railroad and catch a train out of the territory." The leader spoke quickly in Chinese to his companions, and they responded with obvious excitement. But then the leader held up his hand and looked back at Jake with suspicion. "If she left this afternoon, why are the tracks so fresh? It has been raining for hours." Jake's mind raced. "She came back. She was scared and cold, and she came back for shelter. But when she saw you men were still around, she ran again." The leader considered this, but Jake could see he wasn't entirely convinced. One of the other men spoke in Chinese, pointing toward the back of the house. "My friend thinks we should search the house anyway," the leader said. "Just to be thorough." Jake stepped directly in front of his rifle. "I've told you what you wanted to know. She's gone. Now I want you off my property." The leader's facade of politeness finally dropped completely. He drew a pistol and pointed it at Jake's chest. "Mr. Morrison, you will step away from that rifle and you will allow us to search every room of this house. If you cooperate, we will leave you alive. If you resist, we will kill you and search anyway." Jake looked at the gun pointed at him and made his decision. He had promised Li Wei he would protect her, and he intended to keep that promise regardless of the cost. "No," Jake said simply. The leader's eyes widened in surprise. "No?" "That's right, no. You want to search my house? You're going to have to go through me." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the leader gestured to his men, and they began to spread out, preparing to overwhelm Jake. Jake's hand inched closer to his rifle. "You are making a very foolish mistake," the leader said. "We are 3 against 1, and we are all armed." Jake smiled grimly. "Maybe, but this is my house, and I know every inch of it. You're the ones making the mistake." The leader was about to respond when a voice came from the back of the house. "Let him go." Everyone turned to see Li Wei standing in the doorway of the back room, holding an old shotgun that had belonged to Sarah. Her hands were steady, and her voice was calm, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. "Li Wei, I told you to stay hidden," Jake said urgently. "I will not let you die for me," Li Wei replied, not taking her eyes off the 3 men. The leader smiled triumphantly. "There she is! I knew you were lying." He kept his pistol trained on Jake, but spoke to Li Wei. "Put down the gun, wife. You belong to us now." Li Wei's grip on the shotgun tightened. "I am not your wife. My husband is dead, and I owe you nothing." "You owe us the money Chen stole," the leader said. $50,000 that belongs to our employer." "I do not have your money," Li Wei said firmly. "I threw it in a river rather than keep it." The leader's face darkened with anger. "Then you will have to pay in other ways." Jake saw the leader's finger begin to tighten on the trigger, and he knew he was out of time. In one fluid motion, he grabbed his rifle and dove to the side, firing as he moved. His shot caught the leader in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his pistol. The room erupted in chaos. The 2 remaining men drew their weapons and began firing wildly. Jake rolled behind his heavy wooden table, bullets splintering the wood around him. Li Wei fired the shotgun, the blast echoing through the house, and one of the men cried out in pain. Jake came up from behind the table and fired again, hitting the second man in the chest. The man staggered backward and fell heavily to the floor. The third man, seeing his companions down, made a run for the door. Jake pursued him onto the porch, where the man was struggling to mount his horse. Jake's rifle shot knocked the man from the saddle, and he lay still in the muddy yard. Jake stood on his porch, breathing heavily, the rain washing the smoke from his rifle. Li Wei appeared beside him, still holding the shotgun, her face pale but determined. "Are they all dead?" she asked quietly. Jake walked out into the yard and checked each man carefully. The leader was still alive but badly wounded and unconscious. The other two were dead. "One's still breathing," Jake reported, coming back to the porch. "But he's not going anywhere." Li Wei set down the shotgun and collapsed into Jake's arms. The fear and tension she had been holding back for days finally overwhelmed her, and she began to sob. Jake held her tightly, stroking her hair and whispering reassurances. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe now. They can't hurt you anymore." They stood there in the rain for several minutes, holding each other and letting the reality of what had happened sink in. Finally, Jake led Li Wei back into the house, stepping carefully around the bodies and debris. "What happens now?" Li Wei asked as Jake built up the fire to warm them both. Jake looked around his living room, which would never be the same after the violence it had witnessed. "Now we clean up this mess and figure out what to tell the sheriff when he comes." Li Wei looked worried. "Will there be trouble for you? For killing these men?" Jake shook his head. "They came onto my property armed, threatened to kill me, and tried to kidnap you. Any sheriff in Montana would call it self-defense." He paused and looked at Li Wei seriously. "But there might be others looking for you. This probably isn't over completely." Li Wei nodded, understanding the implications. "Then what should I do?" Jake took her hands in his. "Li Wei, I want you to stay. I want you to marry me and make this ranch your home. We'll face whatever comes together." Li Wei's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy. "Are you sure? People will talk. A white rancher married to a Chinese woman." Jake pulled her close. "Let them talk. The people whose opinions matter will judge you by who you are, not where you came from. And anyone who has a problem with it can stay off my land." Li Wei kissed him deeply, pouring all of her gratitude and love into the gesture. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." The storm outside began to ease as the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon. Jake and Li Wei worked together to clean up the aftermath of the fight, moving the bodies outside and scrubbing bloodstains from the wooden floors. As they worked, they planned their future together. 3 months later, Jake Morrison and Li Wei were married by the circuit preacher in a small ceremony attended by their closest neighbors. Li Wei had transformed Sarah's garden into something more beautiful than it had ever been, and she had brought laughter and warmth back to the ranch house that had been silent for so long. The leader of the men who had hunted Li Wei survived his wounds but was tried and convicted for attempted kidnapping and murder. His testimony led to the arrest of several other members of the criminal organization that had employed Chen, effectively ending the threat to Li Wei's safety. Li Wei never forgot the debt of gratitude she owed to the lonely rancher who had given her shelter when she had nowhere else to go. And Jake never forgot the morning he had found a frightened woman in his barn and discovered that his heart was still capable of love. On quiet evenings, they would sit together on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant colors. Li Wei would tend to her garden while Jake read aloud from the book Sarah had left behind, and both of them would marvel at how dramatically their lives had changed from that first dawn when she had stepped across the threshold of his home. The ranch that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sound of Li Wei's voice singing Chinese lullabies to the vegetables in her garden, and with Jake's laughter as she taught him words in her native language. They had found in each other not just love, but a sense of purpose and belonging that neither had expected to discover again. Years later, When travelers would ask Jake about his beautiful wife and how they had met, he would smile and tell them the story of a frightened woman who had hidden in his barn and changed his life forever. And Li Wei, listening nearby, would always add that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the greatest troubles, and that courage and kindness can overcome any obstacle when two people face them together. The Double M Ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where travelers of any background could find a hot meal and a safe place to rest. Jake and Li Wei never turned away anyone in need, remembering how important it had been to find shelter and acceptance when Li Wei had been running for her life. Their love story became a legend in the small Montana community, proof that the bonds between people transcend differences in race, culture, and background. In a time and place where such relationships were often met with suspicion and hostility, Jake and Li Wei Morrison showed that love, respect, and shared values were stronger than prejudice and fear. As the sun set on another peaceful day at the Double M Ranch, Jake and Li Wei would often reflect on the morning that had changed everything. What had started with a frightened woman seeking shelter in a barn had blossomed into a partnership that enriched both of their lives and created a legacy of compassion and acceptance that would endure for generations. The barn where Li Wei had first hidden became a symbol of new beginnings for both of them. Jake converted part of it into a workshop where Li Wei could dry the herbs from her garden and create the medicines and remedies her mother had taught her to make. The space that had once harbored fear and desperation was transformed into a place of healing and hope. And every morning, as Jake stepped out of his house to tend to his ranch, he would look toward that barn and remember the day his solitary life had become a shared journey of love, courage, and redemption. Li Wei had stepped into his home and into his heart, and neither of them had ever looked back.